The gate had not moved in 11 years. Everyone in Ashenvale knew that. The rust on the iron bars had gone the color of old blood. The stone lions on either side had lost their faces to the rain, worn down to something more like ghosts than guardians. The Pemberton Estate, or what the locals still called the Pemberton Estate out of habit, even though that name had not been accurate for 30 years, sat at the end of the lane like a held breath. Present, unchanged, forgotten. And then one morning in August, a man unlocked it. Nobody saw him arrive. That was the strange part. One day the gate was rusted shut and the path behind it was a tangle of chest-high weeds and collapsed rose canes. The next morning there was a man inside, already on his knees in the dirt, already working, as if he had materialized from the ground itself. He was not young, somewhere past 60, maybe further. His hands were already dark with soil before 8 in the morning. His jacket was the washed-out green of someone who had spent decades outdoors and stopped caring what color things started as. He carried no sign. He spoke to no one. He simply worked. By the end of that first day, 3 meters of the east path had been cleared. By the end of the second, the stone lions had been scrubbed back to life. The village watched from a careful distance, the way English villages watch anything unfamiliar with great attention and absolute pretense of indifference. People called him the gardener, not unkindly, just practically. It was the only explanation that fit. Nobody thought to ask who had given him the key. 3 houses up the lane, slightly uphill, Edith Calloway was watching from her kitchen window. She was 71 years old. She had lived in Ashenvale for 43 of those years, long enough to remember when that gate last opened, long enough to remember the family whose name was carved into the stone plaque above it. She had buried a husband in this village. She had watched 2 sons grow into men who now lived in cities far enough away that their visits felt more like courtesy calls than comfort. Her body had been waging a quiet war against her for the last 4 years. The kind of war with no clear front line, just a knee that failed her on cold mornings, a back that reminded her every evening what she had asked of it during the day. She had made her peace with it the way practical women make peace with things they cannot change. She redirected the energy. She put it into her garden instead, a small, fierce patch of land behind the cottage where she grew tomatoes and sweet peas, and one ancient apple tree she refused to cut down, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence grown from the same seed stock for 22 years running. She had noticed the man on his first morning. She had watched him for a while, said nothing to anyone about it, and gone back to her tea. But she kept watching. There was something about the way he worked that she could not name. It was not simply skill, though he clearly had it. It was the quality of his attention. She saw him crouch beside a dying rose bush and simply look at it, not touching, not rushing, just studying it the way a person studies something they want to understand before they interfere with it. Then he did something careful with the soil around the base. Then he moved on. She thought about that image for 2 full days. On the 5th morning, the heat climbed past 34 degrees before noon. Edith watched from her window as the man worked straight through the midday sun without stopping. No shade, no staff, no one bringing him anything. He had arrived with a single water bottle that she had watched him finish before 10 o'clock. By 12:30, he had been working for over 4 hours in that heat with nothing left to drink, and he showed no sign of stopping. She stood at the window for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she went to the well. Not the tap, the actual stone well that her husband Garrett had restored in 1987, the one that pulled up water cold and clean in a way that tap water never quite manages. She filled a large jug. She found 2 cups, a cloth, a basket. She did not add lemon. She did not fuss. She walked down the lane and knocked 3 times on the iron gate. He did not hear her at first. He was at the far end of the garden, crouched near a dry fountain clogged with years of dead leaves and compacted rain dirt. She waited. She was good at waiting. When he finally looked up and saw her, something moved across his face that stopped her. It was not surprise, or not only surprise. It was closer to recognition, the expression of a man encountering something he had quietly stopped expecting. Something simple, something kind. He walked toward her slowly, wiping his hands on the back of his trousers. The gesture was so instinctively careful, so old-fashioned in the best sense, that it caught in her chest a little. "I noticed you'd run out," she said, holding the jug through the gap in the bars. He looked at the jug, then at her. Then he reached through and took it with both hands, the way you hold something you mean to be careful with. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. His accent was difficult to place, not local, not quite southern, somewhere between the two, like a voice that had traveled enough to stop belonging cleanly to any one place. He poured a cup, drank it slowly, poured another. He did not fill the silence with small talk. He did not perform gratitude. He simply drank the water and let the quiet sit between them without embarrassment. Edith found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not need him to say anything more. She told him to leave the jug by the gate when he was finished. Then she turned and walked home. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 9th day, he was already at the gate when she arrived. He had washed his face. His hair was combed, and in his hands, those soil-darkened, capable, permanently working hands, he held a single rose stem. It had bloomed overnight. The color was deep and complicated, somewhere between dark red and something older, something that had no clean name. She took it without speaking. "I don't know your name," she said after a moment. He was quiet, not evasive, careful in the way of a man about to say something larger than the conversation expects. "My name is Edmund," he said. "Edmund Ashford Crane." The name landed slowly. Edith looked at the stone plaque above the gate. At the carved letters she had walked past for 43 years without thinking about them. Then she looked back at the man in the worn green jacket with the dirty hands and the single water bottle and the key that had opened a gate no one else had touched in 11 years. She understood. She had been bringing water every morning to the man who owned all the water. And from the way he was looking at her, not with embarrassment, not with the careful authority of a man used to being recognized, but with something quieter and rower than either of those, she understood something else too. He had needed every single cup of it. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a house that has been empty for a long time. It is not the same as ordinary quiet. It has weight to it, texture, like the walls themselves are holding something in, some memory of noise, of footsteps, of a kettle boiling and a door closing and a voice calling from one room to another. A house like that does not feel abandoned. It feels paused, as if it is waiting for someone to come back and tell it that it is allowed to be a home again. Edmund Ashford Crane had been living inside that silence for 11 years. The strange part was how ordinary it had come to feel. Edith did not ask him questions the morning after she learned his name. She was too wise for that. She had lived long enough to know that some things cannot be pulled at directly. You have to make the ground soft first. You bring the water, you wait. You let the truth come up in its own time, or you let it stay buried and you accept whichever one it chooses. So she simply stood at the gate a moment longer than usual, looked at the rose in her hand and said, "It's a beautiful color." "It's called Reine des Violettes," Edmund said. "Queen of Violets. My mother planted it in 1971. I wasn't certain it had survived." Edith tilted the stem slightly in the morning light. The petals caught it and held it the way old things sometimes hold light completely without showing off. "Things survive longer than we expect them to," she said. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back up the lane. She had her own archives, not written down anywhere, stored the way long-term village residents store things, in layers, in half-memories, in the gaps between what people said and what they meant. Over the following 2 days, she turned the name Ashford Crane over in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath it. It came back to her slowly. The family had been here for generations, not the showy kind of old money, not the kind that ends up in newspapers for the wrong reasons. The quiet kind. The kind that becomes part of a place the way a tree becomes part of a garden, so gradually and completely that you stop seeing it as something separate and start seeing it as something structural. The estate had been a working home once, full of staff, full of the specific, unhurried busyness of a family that took its land seriously. And then 11 years ago it had simply stopped. The gate had rusted. The lions had lost their faces. The village had talked in the way villages talk, in pieces and assumptions and the comfortable spaces between what they actually knew and what they felt free to invent. There had been a death, more than one, some said, a dispute, a man who left not because he was forced out but because he had chosen to go and then had never come back. That man, she now understood, was Edmund. He began to talk on the 11th day. It was a Thursday. The heat had not broken yet, but it had softened slightly, the way brutal things sometimes ease before they end entirely, as if offering a truce that is not quite a surrender. He had found a bench near the old kitchen garden, iron and oak, solid, the kind of thing built to last longer than the people who commissioned it. He had cleaned it, straightened it, set it back where it belonged. When Edith arrived that morning, he was not working. He was simply sitting with his hands on his knees, looking at the far wall where a fig tree had spent 11 years growing enormous and uncontrolled, and magnificently alive with no one watching it. She brought the water, 2 cups as always. She sat beside him without asking. He told her about his wife first. Her name was Caroline. She had died 4 years before he left the estate, not 11 years ago as the village had assumed, but 7. He had stayed 4 years after losing her, trying to hold the shape of the life they had built together. The way you keep a chair at the table, the way you leave a coat on its hook, not because you have forgotten, precisely because you haven't. He said she used to sit in the kitchen garden on summer mornings with her coffee going cold beside her, because she always forgot to drink it when she was reading. He said the fig tree had been her favorite thing on the whole property. She used to press her palm flat against the bark and say it felt like something that had decided to survive. Edith listened. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would improve upon the silence, and she had learned, through Garrett, through years of sitting with people in difficult moments, that the most useful thing you can offer a person who is finally speaking is simply the certainty that you will not leave while they are doing it. Then he told her about his son. This part came slower. It cost him more. She could see it in the way he poured a second cup of water and held it without drinking, turning it in his hands, as if the weight of it was useful somehow. His son's name was Thomas, 41 now, living in Edinburgh with a wife and 2 young children that Edmund had met only once, briefly, at a family funeral 3 years ago, one of those occasions that brings people into the same room without making them close again. Thomas had wanted to sell the estate after Caroline died. He had been practical about it, Edmund said carefully. Not cruel, practical. The house was too large, too expensive, too full of a past that was doing neither of them any good to maintain. Edmund had refused. They had argued not once, but across 4 years, the same argument changing shape without ever really changing subject, until one morning Thomas had simply stopped coming. And Edmund, too proud and too broken in equal measure, had not gone after him. "And then you left anyway," Edith said quietly. Not a judgment, just naming what she understood. Edmund looked at the fig tree for a long moment. 4 years of refusing to leave, he said. And then I left. I've been thinking about that ever since. Where did you go? Something close to a smile moved across his face. Everywhere that wasn't here. I bought a small place in Gloucestershire. I worked other people's gardens. I learned how to be useful to people who had no idea who I was. He paused. It was the best thing that happened to me, strange as that sounds. Edith looked at the fig tree, at the fountain still dry in the distance, at the roses along the east wall beginning one by one to find their color again. It doesn't sound strange, she said. It sounds like you needed to find out what was left of you when you took the title away. He turned and looked at her directly then, the way a person looks when they have heard something true and are deciding whether to let it land or deflect it. He let it land. Yes, he said, that is exactly what it was. The morning of the 16th day changed something. She had not planned what she said. It came out of her the way things sometimes come out in older age, without the hesitation that used to edit her, without the self-consciousness of a younger woman calculating how she would be received. She had simply run out of patience for circling around things that mattered. He was working at the fountain again. He had cleared it completely now and found the original drainage mechanism intact underneath years of debris. He was genuinely pleased about this. The quiet, solid pleasure of a man who has discovered that something he feared was gone has only been buried. She watched him for a moment. My husband Garrett, she said, spent the last 2 years of his life convinced he had failed at everything that mattered. He was wrong, but nothing I said could reach him by then. She paused. The people who loved him knew the truth. The trouble was he had stopped being able to hear us. Edmund set down his tool. I'm telling you this, she said, Because you have a son in Edinburgh, and I think you came back here for the same reason Garrett used to walk out to the garden in the evenings. Not because the garden needed him, because he needed somewhere to stand while he worked up the courage to do the harder thing. The silence that followed was long. A wood pigeon called from the old elm at the far end of the garden. The cleared fountain basin caught a piece of the morning light and held it. Edmund said nothing, but something in the way he was sitting shifted, the way a door that has been closed for a long time moves slightly in its frame when the wood finally begins, after a long, cold season, to breathe again. Edith left the water and walked home. That evening she sat at her kitchen table and cried a little. Not for Edmund, not exactly for Garrett, more for the stubborn human habit of waiting too long to say the thing that needs saying, and then the relief, the overwhelming and unexpected relief of finding out the chance had not yet passed. The honey jar had no business being perfect. 28 years in a cold stone larder buried under a collapsed shelf, sealed inside a wooden box that nobody had opened since the last good summer of a woman's life. By every reasonable measure, it should have been lost, crystallized, ruined. One more thing the years had quietly taken. But when Edmund lifted the lid and held the jar to the light, the honey inside moved. Slow and amber and completely alive. He stood in that cold larder for a long time, holding it. He had found the box on the 17th day, while clearing the shelving along the north wall of the estate's old kitchen. 12 jars in total. Caroline's handwriting on each label, the ink slightly faded but still perfectly legible. Ashenvale Kitchen Garden, 1998. Lavender and borage from the summer before she first became ill. Sealed properly, kept dark and cool entirely by accident. Preserved by a broken shelf that had fallen across them like a roof, and then been forgotten along with everything else. He brought one jar to the gate the following morning. Edith arrived to find him already waiting, which had become his habit on the days something had shifted inside him, the days he needed to give something rather than receive it. He held the jar out through the gap in the bars. "You've been bringing water every morning," he said. "It seemed right to give you something that came from here." Edith took it carefully. She tilted it slightly in the early light. The honey moved with the slow, deliberate weight of something that had made a long journey and arrived exactly as it intended to. She did not trust herself to say much. "Thank you, Edmund," she said. He nodded, the way a person nods when the gesture is carrying more than it shows. He made the phone call that afternoon. He had eaten his dinner at the kitchen table, the wide oak one with the old burn mark on one corner from a candle left too close, decades ago, by someone no longer alive to remember doing it. After he finished eating, he stayed at the table. He did not move for nearly an hour. Just sat with the phone in front of him and the clock on the wall ticking the way it had ticked since he was 8 years old. The one with the Roman numerals, and the small chip on the lower right of the face where a cricket ball had struck it in 1969. Thrown by his older brother who had been dead for 20 years. The clock was still keeping perfect time. He picked up the phone. Thomas answered on the 4th ring. There was a silence on both ends before either of them spoke. Not an angry silence. The silence of two people standing on opposite banks of something wide, suddenly noticing that the water between them is not as deep as they had separately decided it was. Edmund said he had not rehearsed anything. He had thought about it for weeks without rehearsing it, which is a different thing entirely. He said, "I'm back at the house. I'd like you to come and see it when you're ready, and I'd like to meet the children properly, if that's something you'd want." He stopped there. He had prepared himself for Thomas to be careful, for a long pause followed by something measured and non-committal. All of that would have been fair. Instead, Thomas said, "I wondered when you'd go back." Not with anger. Not even with particular surprise, with the quiet certainty of a son who had known his father well enough, even across 11 years of silence, to have been half expecting this exact phone call without ever admitting it to himself. They talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Edith listened to all of it the next morning, standing at the gate in air that smelled of rain coming, that particular English countryside smell of wet soil and old grass, and something ancient waking up after a long, dry spell. When Edmund finished, she looked at the gray sky above the estate wall and breathed it in and felt something move through her chest that she could only describe as second-hand relief. The kind you feel when someone you have quietly started to care about steps back from the edge of something they cannot afford to fall into. "When is he coming?" she asked. 3 weeks, Edmund said. "He's bringing the family." The fountain ran again on a Friday. Edmund had worked on the mechanism for the better part of a week. The basin had been resealed. The underground pipework miraculously had held. A specialist in Bath who dealt in Victorian garden ironwork had sourced the 2 replacement components needed for the original pump. A man who had become, by Edmund's account, genuinely delighted by the problem in the way that people who love their craft become delighted by anything that challenges them properly. Edith was at the gate when Edmund turned it on. The water came up slowly at first, uncertain, the way water moves when it has been still for a long time and needs a moment to remember its direction. Then it steadied, rose, and fell in a clean arc over the lip of the upper bowl, and the sound it made, water falling onto old stone in a quiet garden, filled the whole space with something that had been missing for 11 years, without anyone being able to name exactly what it was. Edmund stood watching it. He did not look triumphant. He looked relieved. The way a man looks who has been holding his breath for so long he had stopped noticing the strain of it and has finally simply let it go. He turned and looked at her through the gate. "Come in," he said. She realized she had been waiting for those 2 words without knowing it. She pushed the gate open and walked through. The garden smelled of wet stone and turned earth and lavender, finding its footing again in soil that had been neglected but not destroyed. The fig tree at the far end stood enormous and green and wildly, stubbornly alive. The roses along the east wall were opening one by one in that deep, complicated red she had come to think of as the color of something given a second chance. They sat together on the iron and oak bench beside the fountain. They listened to the water, to the wood pigeon in the old elm, to the first drops of rain beginning to find the leaves overhead. Neither of them felt the need to fill any of it with words. Thomas came on a Saturday in late September. He was tall, with Edmund's hands and his mother's way of taking in a room, all of it at once, before settling on any single part. His wife Miriam had steady eyes and asked immediately if she could see the kitchen garden, which Edith thought was a very good sign. Their daughter Rosa was 9 years old and ran straight for the fig tree the moment she was through the gate, as if she had been told about it already and had been waiting the entire drive to reach it. Their son William was 6. He walked directly to the fountain, crouched down, and put his small hand into the water. Then he looked up at his grandfather with an expression that had no complexity in it at all, just pure, uncomplicated wonder at the fact of cold water on a warm afternoon. Edmund crouched down beside him. He put his own hand in the water. "It's cold," William said, with the full authority of a 6-year-old reporting something important. "It comes from very deep underground," Edmund told him. "It's been waiting down there a long time." The boy considered this seriously, the way small children consider things they find genuinely interesting. "Was it lonely?" he asked. Edmund looked at the water moving over the old stone, at his grandson's wet hand, at the garden around them, restored, breathing, alive again in the long golden light of a September afternoon. "Probably," he said, but it remembered what it was for. Edith walked home that evening along the lane as the light turned the color that September saves for its finest performances. She carried her empty water jug. In her other hand she held the jar of amber honey, which she had not yet opened and was not quite ready to open, not because she was saving it for anything specific, but because some things are valuable precisely in the holding, in the knowing they are there. Proof that something made with care in a good summer can travel through years of cold and dark and still arrive, in the end, exactly as it was meant to be. She had set out 5 weeks ago to give a man a drink of water. She turned her key in the cottage door, smelled the apple tree and the sweet peas and 22 years of the same sunflower seeds doing what they had always done. She thought about Garrett, about Thomas, about a 6-year-old boy with his hand in a fountain asking whether water could be lonely. She thought it never travels in one direction. It never did.